Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for this opportunity to share in your conference by video link. I've been asked to look at the relationship between Britain and Palestine over the past 100 years. Now, to try and fit into 10 minutes 100 years of history is an enormous, if not impossible, task. It was 100 years ago this week that Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, promising to support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It was an event that gave rise to much controversy at the time and even until now. We're told at the time the British cabinet was split over the declaration, with some very senior members vehemently opposing it. We know that the majority of the Arab world then and now saw it as an act of double-dealing and betrayal. In a letter from Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, dated the 24th of October 1915, Britain promised Hussein, the Sheriff of Mecca, support for an independent kingdom under his rule, provided that he would organize the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire that were aligned with Germany. Hussein assumed that the British promise included Palestine. But a year later, Britain reached a secret agreement with France to divide the Middle East into spheres of influence. In what became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Palestine was to be placed under international control. The land of Palestine, therefore, became twice promised. Many at the time regarded this as an act of fraudulence and deception on the part of Britain. This perception of double-dealing was further endorsed when it became known that behind the scenes, Britain was assuring Hussein that, and I quote, "the Arab race shall be given full opportunity of once again forming a nation in the world," and that despite Britain's support for the aspiration of the Jewish people to return to the land of Palestine, this had to be compatible with, and again I quote, "the freedom of the existing population, both economic and political." Hussein, therefore, was guaranteed that Britain was determined that no people shall be subject to another. Hussein felt betrayed and accused Britain of a breach of faith. Britain not only failed to implement these assurances, as history tells us, but during its mandate, it made no effort to encourage a democratic leadership or self-governing institutions that could lay the foundations or structures for an independent Palestinian state, despite the fact that this was the explicit aim of their mandate in the region. Furthermore, Britain's response to the Arab uprising in 1936 to 1939 totally undermined the Palestinian nationalist movement. Palestinians suffered huge casualties, which decimated the cause for independence. 5,000 died, 10,000 were injured, 6,000 imprisoned, and dozens of key political leaders exiled. After all of this, in 1948, Britain decided to unilaterally walk away by relieving itself of its obligations to the region and handed its mandate to the United Nations, which was recently formed. Looking at British behaviour during this period, it's evident that policies were driven by what was perceived as its interests and not by any moral values or political principles. It would appear that the religious, civil and political rights of the people of the region were not high on the agenda in determining British policies. The universal lesson to be taken from a study of this period is that when interests override values, we sow the seeds of ongoing conflict. Putting values first is in all our interests. Yesterday at Central Hall in Westminster in London, over 1,000 people met to discuss the Balfour Declaration. The title of the conference was Britain's Broken Promise, Time for a New Approach. It was recognised that Britain failed to live up to the latter half of the Balfour Declaration, which stated, "Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." The British, it was said, spoke of their dual obligations throughout the period of mandate, but failed to live up to these obligations with regard to the Palestinian people. Also this week, Boris Johnson, the British Foreign Minister, and the Shadow Foreign Minister, Emily Thornberry, called for a sovereign Palestinian state. Johnson spoke of the need for a viable and contiguous state, the borders based on the lines they stood on June 4th, 1967. These declarations may fall well short of the aspirations of many Palestinians, but it's an indication that 100 years on, we may be beginning to rediscover our values and recognise these should be a significant factor in determining our foreign policy. Throughout the 1920s, Palestine was sometimes referred in British documents as the Second Ireland. What was meant was the situation in Palestine and in Ireland at the time was very similar, in the sense you had competing claims to the same land with two peoples in revolt against British rule. After 800 years of violence, Ireland is now on the path to finding a political solution to resolve a conflict which left a deep scar on numerous generations over the centuries. This process is proving to be long and at times extremely painful. But given that the starting point was zero trust, that is hardly surprising. The key to the change in Ireland was the realisation by the British government and the international community, in particular America, that no conflict can be resolved without an inclusive process. No one who is sincere in the search for a solution to a conflict should be excluded. There should be no preconditions on those wishing to engage. The Palestinian elections in 2006 provided the international community with a unique opportunity for a new approach towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But we failed to grasp the opportunity because we refused to accept the outcome and to respect the democratic choice of the Palestinian people. We set preconditions and prescriptions, and by so doing help to institutionalize the political and factional divisions among the Palestinian peoples over the past decade. Now today, we're offered a renewed opportunity by the Palestinian people to support your current efforts at political and factional reconciliation. I hope we can learn from the past 100 years of mistakenly putting our perceived interests before our democratic principles. Palestinian political and factional reconciliation is, I believe, the opportunity to open a new and more hopeful chapter on a long road of self-determination as an independent nation and sustainable state. I thank you for your attention and I wish you a good conference. Ma salam.